Hey, so this is your Newsela article for the week. I'm going to go ahead and read it out loud in case you would like that accommodation. So to read it out loud, the first thing, we need to make sure we're all on the same lexile level. So go into the upper right-hand corner of your article and switch it. I'm going to read it out loud in the 930 level since that is 7th grade level. So go ahead and make it 9:30 on your article. And then you could have this video playing in the background while you read along in your own article and annotate in your own article. So our title is Back and Forth Across the Atlantic in the Columbian Exchange. In 1492, when Christopher Columbus famously sailed from Europe to the Americas, the four world zones became connected for the first time, and a new era in human history began. Humans had created a truly global network. Okay, remember one of the things you're supposed to do with this assignment is to annotate, and you're annotating for our unit's essential question, which is how did the world become more interconnected through trade? I think this is a great place to annotate right off the bat, so I'm just going to remind you how to do it. I'm not going to do all of your annotations for you. I just want to remind you how to. So to annotate on Newsela, all you do is you highlight the section that you want to annotate. So when Christopher Columbus famously sailed from Europe to the Americas, the four world zones became connected for the first time. Okay, once I highlight it, I could choose my color to highlight. I always like purple. And then you click here in the little text box and you write it here. So I'm going to say Columbus discovering, and I put discovering in quotation marks. He didn't really discover it. There were already people living there. But he discovered it for Europeans, or at least mostly for Europeans. It's in dispute as if he's actually the first one. Turns out he's probably not. So I put discovering in quotation marks. So Columbus discovering the Americas connected the world. There we go. And then I have that annotation done and it saves it automatically once I click off of it. So continuing to read the article. Now plants and animals could move back and forth across the Atlantic Ocean. Historians call this the Columbian Exchange. Okay, this is a really important part. This week we're talking about the Columbian Exchange in history. All that is it's the trade of plants and animals across the Atlantic Ocean from Europe, Asia, and Africa over to the Americas, and then from the Americas back to Afro-Eurasia. So that's all the Columbian Exchange is it's that trade of plants and animals. I want to understand the consequences of the Columbian Exchange. To do this, I'll investigate the movement of plants, animals, and people across the Atlantic between 1492 and 1850. In the end, I want to figure out what impact these movements had. New global networks were being created. What effect did they have on the peoples and regions of the earth? What was exchanged between 1492 and 1850? So first off, I'm going to notice there's a map right here, and you could click this map to enlarge it and look at it in the bottom left-hand corner here, and it lists, like all of these things listed here went from North America to Afro-Eurasia. Afro-Eurasia meaning Africa, Europe, and Asia. And then all of these things listed here where this arrow is, they were from Afro-Eurasia originally, and then they went to the Americas. It's always important to look at the pictures in these articles. The first step in my historical investigation is asking questions to figure out what actually happened. What was exchanged on the new Atlantic networks? What things moved east or west across the Atlantic? To answer these questions, I'll need to gather information from some history and science books. To create the map and chart below, I used two sources. Both books are by Alfred W. Crosby, The Columbian Exchange, Biological and Cultural Consequences of 1492 and Ecological Imperialism, the Biological Expansion of Europe, 900 to 1900. Whew, that is a mouthful. The map and chart show what items moved back and forth across the Atlantic in the Columbian Exchange. And then again, here is a chart. And you could see, this is just a chart form of the map that you saw. These are things that moved east, so they went from the Americas to Afro-Eurasia. And then these things are things that went west, so from Afro-Eurasia to the Americas. Super cool. Okay, continuing the article. Plant and animal exchange surprises. I was surprised by the things that were introduced to the Americas by European travelers: horses, sheep, honeybees, earthworms, sugarcane, wheat, fruits, coffee plants, and diseases. These things have been common in the Americas for a long time. I assumed they had always been here. Can you imagine North America without horses, cattle, honeybees, earthworms, or coffee? I was also surprised to learn what items traveled from the Americas to Europe after 1492. Corn, potatoes, and turkeys, for example. Before the Columbian exchange, foods like potatoes, tomatoes, chili peppers, and cocoa didn't grow in Europe, Africa, or Asia. There's no evidence that Afro-Eurasian people knew about or used these foods. Today, I can't imagine Italian food without tomatoes or Indian food without chili peppers. Some of the exchange that happened was on purpose. Europeans planned to introduce new plants and animals into the Americas. For example, Spanish explorers brought olive trees over on their ships so they could plant them in the New World. Europeans also brought over crops such as sugar, coffee, cotton, and ginger. They hoped these would grow well in the Americas so they could sell them for a profit back in Europe. These crops did grow quite well in Brazil, the Caribbean, and in North America. Tobacco, a crop that was native to South America, joined sugar, coffee, and various spices to become very important commodities that Europeans traded around the world. In their book, The Human Web, historians J.R. McNeill and his father William McNeill argue that the movement of plants was often a decision tied to money. Moving certain plants was often organized by the kings and queens of Europe, who wanted to make large profits or increase scientific knowledge. However, some exchange happened by accident. Seeds sometimes traveled as secret passengers in other food sources. Historian Louis Martin tells a story from 1535 about how wheat was introduced to Peru in this way. Inés Munoz was related to the famous explorer and conqueror Francisco Pizarro. She was one of the few European women who lived in Lima, Peru at the time. Munoz received a barrel of rice from Spain. In the barrel, she found a few grains of wheat and wondered if the wheat would grow in Peru. She planted the grains of wheat in a flower pot, and soon healthy wheat plants appeared. Munoz began to replant the wheat in the soil of Peru. According to Martin, the wheat crop grew so well that within 3 or 4 years, people began to produce bread in Peru. In addition to these new crops, Europeans also introduced new animals to the Americas: horses, pigs, goats, sheep, and cattle. Some historians argued that these animals were far more important to the indigenous people of the Americas than the new crops were. I can imagine how valuable the horses were for labor and transportation. Riding horses must have helped people control herds of cattle or sheep. New diseases also traveled to America, including microorganisms that carried smallpox, measles, and malaria. The natives had never been exposed to the diseases that Europeans unintentionally carried with them. I learned that the spread of these new diseases was catastrophic for the native peoples, causing many, many deaths. Now that we know what crossed back and forth between Eurasia and America, we can begin to investigate the consequences of these new plants, animals, and microorganisms on the people of the different regions of the world. Okay, at this point, you might want to pause and go back and annotate. This section was interesting. It was just talking about how there are plants, animals, and diseases that did not exist in the Americas. For example, wheat and horses and pigs and cows. Those were only in Afro-Eurasia. Those did not exist in Americas. Now, when the two sides discovered each other, Europeans brought over a lot of those plants and animals and diseases, which had catastrophic consequences, at least the diseases for Native Americans. That being said, there are also plants and animals and diseases in the Americas that did not exist in Europe. For example, corn and tomatoes. Those were things that only existed in the Americas, and once the Europeans discovered the Americas, they got sent back to Europe and Africa and Asia, and people started growing them there. Analyzing the exchanges. Many plants from the Americas grew well in Europe, Asia, and Africa. Maize, or corn, cassava, manioc, and potatoes improved people's diets all over the world. These crops grew fast and they could survive droughts. They were easy to store and they provided a large number of calories. People in Europe, Africa, and Asia benefited from these plants. They now had more variety of foods to eat. Maize, cassava, potatoes, and other American plants such as peanuts, tomatoes, and beans soon spread throughout the world. world population in the Columbian Exchange. I expected that better diets would lead to larger populations, but did populations grow equally everywhere? Did indigenous peoples, the original people in an area, see their populations grow? How did new diseases coming to the Americas affect them? Remember, before 1492, America was home to highly successful civilizations. There were cities, monumental architecture, specialized jobs, and large populations. How did a small number of Europeans conquer and control these civilizations? In the Big History Project video, Recreating Pangaea, historian Charles Mann says there are two main reasons why small groups of Europeans were able to dominate and essentially conquer vast numbers of native people in the Americas in a relatively short period of time. The first, Mann argues, is called the Great Dying. Indigenous people were exposed to new infections that devastated their populations. How many people actually died? How can we possibly know who died? What sources can we use? To begin this part of my research, I found two different estimates for population. The first was published in 1954, M.K. Bennett's The World's Food, a study of the interrelations of world populations, national diets, and food potentials. The second was published in 1979, J.R. Burban's Essai sur l'évolution du nombre d'hommes, which David Christian quotes in Maps of Time and Introduction to Big History. I used information from each source to make the chart below. For now, ignore the differences in the numbers between 1954 and 1979. Instead, look at the trends in each region. What happened to the population in the Americas between 1400 and 1700? What happened to the population in Africa between 1400 and 1700? What about Europe, India, and China? Were there any major increases or decreases in population in any of these regions? Again, click on this map and you could see what they're talking about. For me, the numbers for the Americas between 1500 and 1700 really stand out. This region of the world had a very large decline in population. This area lost around 30 million people during that time. There's no other region of the world that had such a dramatic drop in population. China, India, and Europe had large population growth over that time. Africa either had a bit of growth or possibly even a small decline. Two questions about these figures come to mind. Why are there differences in population estimates? What explains the decline in population in the Americas? Analyzing the numbers. Why did historians from 1954 and 1979 come up with different numbers for historical populations? They were probably looking at different sources of evidence. In general, the Europeans and the Chinese kept track of their own population numbers through census data, counting the population. I'm guessing they did this mainly for financial reasons. They had to keep track of who needed to pay taxes to the government. This type of tracking may have spread to the areas they traded with, such as India and Africa. However, the difference in numbers for India and China are really striking. It looks like the population of China was exaggerated in 1954, and the population of India was greatly underestimated. In 1954, both India and China were having political problems. This may have made it difficult to get accurate numbers from reliable records. By 1979, things had settled down a bit in both countries. I already learned about the great dying that occurred among the native population of the Americas due to their lack of resistance to European diseases. Historian Robert McCaw argues that American peoples experienced a disaster and that disease was a major part of that. However, he says it wasn't just disease that killed many Native Americans. To understand why there was such a huge population decline, we must also consider other factors. The first is harsh treatment. The Europeans forced the natives to move, enslaved them, and forced them to work, and demanded their food as well as valuables like gold and silver. The second is ecological damage. I'm actually going to pause here because the video times out at 15 minutes, you guys. So I'm going to upload a second video where I finish the article. This is a long article. So I will finish up the article in the next video, so you could click that. Before you start the next video, though, make sure that you go back and do the annotations. You really only need maybe 3 to 5 annotations for the entire article. And again, your annotations are just focusing on what was the global impact of trade. So look for the parts where it talks about, the animals and plants that were traded and the disease and the effects of the disease. All right, once you've annotated this part of the article, go ahead and you could watch the second video where I read the rest of it for you.